Hello, everyone, and we are back with another episode of Pranov's History Podcast. For those of you who don't know us, we cover many topics in U.S. history and ask how it represents an era. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different than traditional episodes because it's going to be an audio-visual experience. Usually our podcasts are mostly audio and you just listen along, but today we're going to be putting some photos and videos on the screen for you guys. And if you want to look at it, it would really help in understanding this topic a little bit more. But if you can't, it is not necessary. So yeah, if you can look at the screen will be showing photos and videos, so it'll be helpful to look at them. But like I said before, you don't have to. And if you guys like this sort of format, we can do it again. I'm totally down to do it again. So just hit up the socials at Pranov's History Podcast on Twitter, YouTube, Instagram. You know the jam, and we can make it happen. But let's get back into the topic. Today's topic for the day is about the Chicago 8, their trial, and how they represent the era they were in. In order to dive into this question, you will need some background on the Chicago 8 and their trial, and the era just in general. The era the Chicago 8 trial took place in was defined by multiple events. The Cold War was going on during this time and shaped the event in major ways. For those of you who don't know, the Cold War was a period of nuclear tension between the Soviet Union and the United States. During this time, there was no direct conflict between the two powers, but they did engage in proxy wars. Proxy wars are wars in which two countries do not directly fight another, but do so indirectly. The example that we're going to be talking about in this podcast is the Vietnam War, because this might be this idea of proxy wars might be confusing to people, so I'm going to be using the example of the Vietnam War, and it has a major role in the trial and the Chicago 8. So, but the Vietnam War was a proxy war between the United States and the USSR, or the Soviet Union. Because the United States, and it happened through the United States supporting the democratic South Vietnam, while the USSR supported the communist North Vietnam, or the Viet Cong. The United States and the USSR didn't directly fight in the war, but they supported two parts of a nation that were in a war, and through that opposed each other. And through that, they did it through proxy, which is why it's called the proxy war. This war has a major importance to this trial, and we'll come back to it in a bit. But another defining player of the era was President Nixon. He was running for office and in office during the span of the Chicago 8's run and their trial. His Law and Order campaign was very popular amongst the people of the United States. And the final defining concept during this era was civil rights. While leaders like MLK and Malcolm X were making their mark on history, civil rights was a very important and persistent part of this era. These are all important for later, but let's get back to Vietnam. The Vietnam War caused many casualties and was a source of major controversy in the United States. Many believe that this war would have been an inevitable loss for the United States. It was not worth the casualties, and this is where the Chicago 8 or 7 came in. That I'll explain in a sec. The Chicago 7 were a group that helped organize anti-Vietnam War riots at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. In order for a new beginning for a city, Mayor Daley did not want these anti-war riots to happen. So when people asked for protest permits, he refused these protest permits to the protesters. Still, the people of the Chicago 7 chose to protest, and the protests turned violent. This is the first time I'm going to be showing this audio-visual type thing, probably, and I'll show the video above of the protests turned violent. Now let's talk about the people who were in the Chicago 7. The Chicago 7 consisted of Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, the founders of the Yippies, who organized a festival in life in response to what they thought was a festival of death, which was the Democratic National Convention. These two would be traditionally described as the hippie type. The other defendants with a significant organization were Tom Hayden and Renee Davis, and Tom Hayden co-founded the organization of the SDS while Renee Davis ran it. The others that were also involved in the riots were David Dillinger, John Froines, and Lee Weiner. The 7 were represented mainly by William Kunstler and Leonard Weinglass. But remember how I said Chicago 8 at the start of this podcast? This is because another defendant who had no association with the riots was called in, and his name was Bobby Seale, co-founder of the Black Panther Party, and the only black defendant in this trial. Due to the color of his skin and his significance in the Black Panther Party, he was charged for giving a speech to other members in the Black Panther Party. even though he had no association with the riots. The whole Chicago Eight were charged under a newly passed 1968 Civil Rights Act, which made it illegal to cross state lines with the intent to incite a riot. But according to Nick Sherman, there was not really evidence to prosecute them, and there was more evidence on the police officers. But the trial started anyway and was judged by Judge Julius Hoffman. Let me tell you guys, this guy was pretty crazy. For starters, one of the defendants, Bobby Seale, did not have an attorney due to him being sick, and Judge Julius Hoffman did not accept his request to postpone the trial. He basically denied one of his constitutional rights, which is a right to an attorney. This was only the start of crazy things to happen in the trial. Another absolutely absurd and crazy thing that happened to Bobby Seale was he was gagged and chained to his chair because he called the judge a racist and tried to represent himself. This is absolutely crazy that this actually happened in a courtroom, in a court of law. You see, the judge heavily favored the prosecution, and almost every objection was in the prosecution's favor. This led to the trial being rigged. This led to the trial being rigged. But eventually, back to Bobby Seale, Bobby Seale got his trial declared as a mistrial because he had nothing to do with this trial. But still, the judge sentenced him to 4 years of prison for contempt of the court. For those of you who don't know what contempt of the court is, it is when someone disrespects a courtroom and they can be given fine or prison time. Although Bobby Seale's account, or like him getting chained and gagged, was the most extreme example of Judge Hoffman's cruelty, there were many others. He threw contempt of courts out like there was no tomorrow. One of the most interesting examples was when he gave contempt of court to Tom Hayden for saluting the jury. What I mean by interesting is I mean astonishing that it even happened. Some other examples was the attorney Kunstler receiving 4 years for addressing the judge as Mr. Hoffman instead of Your Honor. Abbie Hoffman got 8 months for laughing. Tom Hayden protested the treatment of Seale, and for standing up for him, he got a year. And Weiner refused to stand for the judge and got two months. At the end of the trial, he had cited all of the Chicago Eight with contempt of the court and their attorneys, he cited a total of 152 citations of contempt of court. So let's just talk about the trial a little bit now. Another aspect of the trial now. And one of these interesting aspects of the trial was that many writers and performers took the stand. People like Dylan Gregory, Allen Ginsberg, and William Stryon were there to support the seven. Even Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General, tried to help the defense. The issue was censorship was a big thing in the trial. The judge believed that the Attorney General had nothing important to say, with the Attorney General being Ramsey Clark, so he did not allow him to speak or give a testimony. He did the same with Vietnam. Even though the Vietnam War was an important part of this trial, he did not allow the discussion of it, most likely because it helped the defense. And like I talked before, the trial was pretty rigged. NPR's guest John Weiner talks about how the Nixon Justice Department view was that the leaders of the protest movement conspired to sort of trick naive people into coming to Chicago and then provoked a riot in violation of federal law. The defense argued that truthfully they had tried repeatedly to get permits to make this illegal protest, and they were not denied first by the city and then by the courts. They couldn't stop people coming to the protest. John Weiner was talking about what was actually going on in the trial, what they were arguing about, and this trial went on while the defense and the prosecution were arguing this thing. But while the trial went on, there was major bias towards the prosecution, like I talked about before. The trial ended with some good news. Freund and Weiner were acquitted completely, but the others members of the Chicago Seven were found guilty of crossing state lines with the intent to start a riot. They each got 5 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. Luckily, 2 years later, an appeal court would throw out all the convictions due to the fact that Judge Hoffman, like I said before, was clearly biased. But now that you know what this event is about, I'm going to explain why I believe it defines an era and its time. The Chicago Eight and the trial symbolized its time through its aspects of the anti-Vietnam War protests, the Nixonian view, and the civil rights discussions. One of the main reasons I believe that the Chicago Eight symbolized their era that it was in was because of its content containing anti-Vietnam War protests. Anti-Vietnam War protests and counterculture were very prevalent at this time, and there are many examples of its involvement with the Chicago Eight. One of the biggest correlations between the Chicago Eight and the anti-Vietnam War protests was that without anti-Vietnam War protests, the trial of the Chicago Seven would have not happened. The Seven were out in Chicago to protest the war, and without the Vietnam War, there would have been no protesting at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, which would have caused which would cause the Seven or Eight to never spark riots, which would cause the Seven to not spark riots, and cause them to not have their trial. Without this era in time, the Chicago Seven the Chicago Seven trial would have not occurred, and these people in their trial would not be real enough to be made into a movie or even remembered in history. Another aspect of the trial of the Chicago Eight was that it correlated to the Vietnam War. Another aspect of the trial of the Chicago Eight that correlated to the Vietnam War was the defense's goal to make the Vietnam War an issue in the trial. See, the defense wanted to try to make the Vietnam War an issue because it was an important aspect of why they were at the protests in the first place, and it would have helped the defense's case in the trial. Even though they tried, Judge Julius Hoffman did not allow it because in his mind, it was relevant to the trial. This led to a major disadvantage for the defense because a major aspect of the trial was being left out. There were still times that the topic came out on the trial and provided relation to the outside world of why this trial was important. Because of the times, the topic of the Vietnam War coming out in court relates to what was happening in the outside world. The final reason that the Chicago Eight correlates to the Vietnam War and anti-Vietnam War protests is that many writers, musicians, and artists who were also anti-war took the stand to help protect the defense and make it so that they don't go to jail. One of these people was Allen Ginsberg, creator of the poem Howl. These writers, musicians, and artists were minor celebrities that were not involved in the trial, but they shared the same sentiments and ideas as the defendants. That is, that the Vietnam War was not necessary. Like-minded ideals were shared all around the world, and these people coming in to the trial showed how the trial represented the era of people having hate towards this war in Vietnam. The Chicago Eight in their trial represented the era that they were in through the massive involvement that the anti-Vietnam War protests had in the trial, due to the fact that it was a massive event going on in this time. Another reason I believe that the trial of the Chicago Eight represented its time was because it was a result and took place during the Nixonian era. A big part of the Nixonian era was President Nixon's importance of his theme of law and order and providing apparent law and order for his citizens. He desired to be the voice of the silent majority, as Weiner called this, by which he referred to white conservatives who were opposed to the black movement in the streets and the counterculture, the movement of young people in the streets. This quote gives you an idea of what the time was like during the Nixonian era, but I would like to talk about 3 specific examples of this idea and President Nixon's involvement in this case. One of the first examples of this is according to NPR. This trial was in order to represent the Nixonian view of law and order and fulfilling a campaign promise more than actually dishing out justice. There was a witness I talked about before, Ramsey Clark, who's going to testify about this and how this trial was a big part of the Nixonian initiative, and if Herbert Humphrey were to be elected, they would not be in favor of repressing these protests that the Seven took. But Nixon did not agree with this idea and put these 2 on trial to sustain his image of law and order. But like I said before, the judge did not approve of Ramsey Clark's testimony, which led to this important fact about the trial being left out. Another example of how the trial represented the Nixonian era was through Abbie Hoffman's quote about President Lincoln during his closing speech. Abbie Hoffman stated, "In 1861, Lincoln said in his inaugural address, 'When the people shall grow weary of their constitutional right to amend their government, they shall exert their revolutionary right to dismember and overthrow that government.'" He gave that speech. If Abraham Lincoln had given that speech in Lincoln Park, he'd be on trial right here, right in this courtroom, because that is an insightful speech. This quote shows that with President Nixon, many things have changed. It talks about the fact that it is the citizens' right to protest and that they should not be oppressed. He talks about how arguably one of the greatest presidents of all time would have been on trial if he was alive during this time. It really shows how Nixon changed the era and played a role in this trial. And without him, there probably would have not been a trial in the first place. The final example of Nixon and the Nixonian views involvement in this case is that Nixon wanted Bobby Seale to be a part of the trial because he wanted to discredit the Black Panther Party. Because of the nature of law and order, Nixon wanted to stop radical groups, especially black radical groups, the biggest of which was the Black Panther Party. So he wanted to discredit them by putting them in the biggest trial of radicals in America, which was the Chicago 7, and with the addition of Bobby Seale became the Chicago 8. It was all a part of Nixon's agenda to get the public approval by keeping on his law and order campaign, and keeping on his law and order theme. Without President Nixon and the Nixonian view, Bobby Seale would have not have been brought to trial. Nixon had a major involvement in this case through his agenda to put law and order out, which was a staple at the time. And the final reason that I believe the trial of the Chicago 8 represented the era was through its discussion on civil rights. Like I talked about, civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X made their stand during this time, so civil rights was a huge discussion. One of the biggest examples of this is when Bobby Seale was put on trial when he was not supposed to be there. Like I talked about before, Bobby Seale had no involvement with the Chicago 7 and was at Chicago to give a speech to the Black Panthers about defunding the police and black power in black communities. Despite the fact that he did not have anything to do with anti-Vietnam War protests, he was still put in this trial and mistreated due to the color of his skin, because Richard Nixon wanted to get rid of black radical groups like his. Another example of civil rights discussions in the trial of the Chicago 7 is that part of the reason it started was because of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Because of its significance to the civil rights movement in the community, there was a lot of violence and turbulence following his assassination. This led all the way to his Democratic National Convention, and it could have contributed to the whole violence that was seen at the convention. Additionally, many of the Chicago 7 were also civil rights activists looking for equal rights between all people. So the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. may have also lit a flame underneath them to protest the war, something Martin Luther King Jr. was famously against. MLK's assassination played a big role in the world and set the events in motion for the trial of the Chicago 7 to happen. The final example of civil rights discussion in the trial of the Chicago 7 was the treatment of Bobby Seale from Judge Julius Hoffman. Initial mistreatments from the judge caused Bobby Seale to call him out as a racist, and many of his actions made it seem that he was. The judge mistreated Bobby Seale in many ways, from not postponing the trial to allow Bobby Seale to have an attorney, to chaining him and gagging him in the court for trying to represent himself. Sorry I didn't tell you about showing a picture before, but I'm going to be showing a picture now on the screen, so if you want to look at that. There's no actual video of the court case, but there was what he called drawings, so I'm going to show you that now. And this was an extreme reaction to the situation, and many wonder how this behavior was allowed in the courtroom, including myself. Many of the other white defendants spoke out against Judge Hoffman, but not get the same absurd treatment that Bobby Seale, a black man, got. It seems pretty apparent that the judge's actions were racist and absurd. Civil rights discussions and movements were very prevalent in the era of this trial, and because of that, it shows up a lot in this trial. Although the Chicago 7 represented their era, they also have many relations today and are important to learn in today's society. Other than the fact that this trial, the Chicago 7, could teach us about the era they were in, because there are so many things about this trial that relate to other things that were going on during the era. Like I talked about before my explanations, things like anti-Vietnam War protests, the Nixonian view, civil rights discussions were all very prevalent during this time, and then they all showed up in this trial and were important things that were discussed during this trial. And many have compared to the protests from the Chicago 7 to BLM protests that have taken place to this day. This trial shows us that a collective action can combat powerful forces of oppression. On a small scale, it shows how a group of people stood up to an oppressive judge. And on a larger scale, it talks about how a group of people stood up to a government who wanted war, which the people did not want. It can be used when any of us are battling oppression to get collective action to help us. And it's really inspiring that they could do this, and it is something we can all learn in our lives. Through its aspects of anti-Vietnam War protests, the Nixonian view, and civil rights discussions, the Chicago 8 trial symbolizes an era. The trial tackles Vietnam War protests, which were a huge part of this time period. Through the trial's reasoning, the defense attempts to make the Vietnam War an issue in the trial, and through its use of writers and artists who were also anti-war. The Chicago 8 is correlated to the Nixonian view because President Nixon's intents for law and order caused him to prosecute the Chicago 8. It also throws us through Abby Hoffman's quote about change and Nixon adding Bobby Seale to the trial to discredit the Black Panther Party. Finally, civil rights discussions were present in the Chicago 8 trial through Bobby Seale being a part of the trial, MLK's assassination role in the Democratic National Convention, and racism from Judge Hoffman. The Chicago 8 was a very interesting event that symbolized the era it was in, and I believe more people should talk about it. But more than symbolizing an era, it has many correlations with everyday life. I hope you guys got that the Chicago 8 trial had aspects of this whole era, which was defined by the Vietnam War protests, Nixonian view, and civil rights discussions, and all of them were present in this trial. And that's all I have for you today. If you want to learn more about the topic, I'd watch the movie The Trial of the Chicago 7 by Aaron Sorkin, and do some research of your own. That movie is how I got introduced to the topic. And if you guys like this new style, the style that I'm trying to do, please let me know, and I'd be down to do it again, like I talked about before. And yeah, I'm sorry I didn't mention when I was going to post the photos, but if you're watching, I hope you saw it. But I hope you guys learned something new and enjoy yourself during this podcast. And now I gotta sign off, so I'll talk to you guys again about the past in the future. Pranav Narayan, signing out.